Thank you, Anna. Hello.
Hi,
How are
everybody.
all of you? Thank you for coming out on this lovely Saturday afternoon.
Yes, you get an inclement weather award.
You win. How are you?
I'm good.
Good. Congrats on the book.
Thank you.
So if you would, I'm going to jump right in, and obviously all of you will have the opportunity to ask questions later on. I know you have some awesome ones, so be thinking. But if you would, Emily, frame for us the state of incarceration in the United States.
Yeah, sure. So there are now more than 2 million people in jail and prison in the United States. That is 5 times the number in the late 1970s. And in the 70s, we had the same rate of incarceration as Scandinavia. So they stayed down here, and we went up here. And we have more people incarcerated than Russia and China and anywhere else in Europe. And I think it's also important to think about all of the additional people affected by those more than 2 million people. So there are 10 million kids who, by the end of their adolescence, will have parents who are incarcerated. And there are actually 70 million Americans with criminal records if you count everybody with an arrest record. And that's the same number of people who have college degrees. So we're talking about a really vast system that has its hooks into many, many people's lives.
How did you come to this story? Why did you want to write this?
So I'm a lawyer by training, not a lawyer anyone should ever hire, but I went to law school. And so I write a lot about legal issues. And several years ago, I was writing about the 3 strikes law in California, which was a really harsh sentencing law. You could wind up in prison for life, even if your second and third offense were nonviolent offenses. And I was talking to the Republican conservative district attorney in Los Angeles. This is in 2010, and he was supporting a ballot initiative in California that was going to curb the most harsh aspects of this law. And it seemed kind of surprising that this guy, Steve Cooley, would be taking that position given his politics. So I asked him why he thought 3 strikes went too far. And he told me a story about a case from way back in the beginning of his own career as a prosecutor. So back in the 90s, in one of his first years, a man named Gregory Taylor was arrested in Los Angeles for unscrewing the hinges in a screen door of a food pantry at a church to get inside because it was closed and he was hungry. So this case file landed not on Steve Cooley's desk, but on the desk of his colleague next to him. And that prosecutor charged this crime as a 3rd strike. And Gregory Taylor went to prison for life. And Cooley told me this story because he said he would never have brought that charge. And it had driven home for him that this law went too far and needed to be reined in. I heard that story and thought, oh my God, so the fact that this case landed on one prosecutor's desk instead of the other determined the whole course of someone's life. I had just never thought before about the discretion that individual prosecutors have. But once you see it, if you're reporting or thinking about the criminal justice system, it's everywhere. And so I kind of noticed it and I kept observing it. And then there are some academics who really did important work on this topic. And I often look for subjects where there are stories to tell and I can see them, but there's also some empirical work that shows that there's really like an underlying pattern. And so there's a professor named Angela Davis at American University who wrote a book about the power of prosecutors long before me. And then more recently, a professor at Fordham named John Pfaff showed that when you look at felony charging, so the idea of bringing serious charges that lead to mass incarceration, that prosecutors doubled the rate at which they charge felonies from 1/3 to 2/3 of cases. And that happened in the same period from the late 80s to about 2010, where we see mass incarceration just skyrocket. So that work from John Pfaff suggested that in the moment where prosecutors control the decision-making, when they bring charges, they were choosing harshness, and that was related to this ballooning prison population.
And we're going to come back to that as well. But one of the other things that you write or that you say is that you felt a sense of urgency to write this book. Why now?
Yes. So Since 2016, we've had this new and emerging, I think, window of opportunity to really address the worst excesses of the system. It's partly because crime is down, and that has sunk in. Now, that's a funny thing to say in Chicago. I know you have a more complicated picture here. But nationally, violent crime has really plummeted. And so I think that people across the country are more open to the notion that mass incarceration has gone way too far, that it wastes tremendous amounts of money. That's an argument that applies to a lot of fiscal conservatives. And also that it's having this really intense human cost in a lot of communities, especially communities of color, low-income communities, and that we're just not getting anything from this, that there are better ways to try to make sure the crime rate stays down that don't take the same toll. And that window of opportunity makes it a really exciting time to be talking about my book, because I feel like there's actually change on the ground, which is, for journalists, change is great. It's exciting, not static.
Gives us something to write about.
Yes.
So in the book, you tell the stories of Kevin, not his real name, and Nora. And these are two wildly different cases, from their location to the charges each of them is facing, and certainly the prosecutors that are charging each of these cases. Why these two?
So Nora Jackson was 18 when her mother was brutally stabbed to death in the middle of the night. A really extreme, brutal case, unusual. Jennifer Jackson, Nora's mom, and Nora are white. This is an upper middle class neighborhood in Memphis. There were no obvious suspects, and so Nora came under suspicion, and the prosecutor in her case charged her with murder. She was convicted, and then her conviction was later overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court. And without giving too much of the story away, in hopes you'll go read about it, Nora's case for me stood for a very hard-charging traditional prosecutor who was exerting her power in a way that, that also involved, in the end, misconduct. And that prosecutor, whose name is Amy Wyrick, was actually elected as the lead district attorney in Memphis after Nora's trial. And there was a pattern of constitutional violations in her office, both before she took over and afterward. So I was just interested in how that happens, like how you can have these kind of grave problems in an office that just continue on and self-perpetuate. So that was why I chose that story. And then the story about Kevin is a story about a progressive prosecutor making promises in Brooklyn, a guy named Eric Gonzalez, coming into power at a time when the mayor in New York, Bill de Blasio, was pushing for mandatory zero-tolerance prison sentences for gun offenders. And I was interested in the population of young people who are being caught up in this move to put all these gun offenders in prison, and what would happen if you tried giving some of them a second chance. So the reporting I did following Kevin's story over a couple of years plays out those questions.
And for those of you who haven't read the book, I'll say that it was difficult to kind of come up with questions without asking a question that would tell you what happens to Nora. And as I'm reading it, it reads kind of like a novel. I'm like, well, I have to keep going to see what happens to Nora and Kevin.
Good, Francis. That's just what I was looking for. Thank you.
You're welcome. But you mentioned the holistic approach that's taken by Brooklyn Defender Services. They introduce a social worker and a defense attorney who actually has time for the client. Because I think a lot of us are used to hearing about the public defender's offices, that they've got a million cases and they just kind of whip them through the system. And it sounds like they're doing it a little bit differently in Brooklyn. What's happening there?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're asking about this, because one of the inevitable issues that arise as you write a book about prosecutors, you sort of necessarily give short shrift to other actors in the system. And one of the most striking features of American criminal justice is that people, public defenders or defense lawyers, especially for poor people, that is totally a local and state decision about how to fund them, who they are, what kind of support they have. Just everything about the staffing of that job is up to the local jurisdiction. So Brooklyn is an exceptional place that has done more to invest in public defender services. And Brooklyn Defender, where Kevin's lawyer came from, it's absolutely customary for lawyers to work in pairs with social workers. And the idea here is that the criminal justice system ends up catching in its net a lot of people whose problems can't really be solved by jail or prison or by traditional lawyering. They need someone who's going to help someone like Kevin figure out how to get a GED, or access other kinds of services. And so what I watched with the lawyer and social worker pair who represented Kevin was this kind of 2 years, really, of helping him navigate the legal challenges he was facing, which were significant, but also trying to just help him make his life better.
So you write, there are several different pieces, it sounds like, that kind of lead to prosecutors having this power that they come into. Some of it is the laws that are made. And then there are several Supreme Court cases that you reference as well that kind of add up to put some systems in place to give prosecutors this amount of power. What are those?
Yeah, so, my basic thesis is that prosecutors over the last 40 years have amassed far more power than our system was designed for. That we kind of imagine that prosecutors and defense lawyers are at like the bottom of a triangle on an even playing field, and then judges are up here as the neutral referee making the key decisions. That's not really how it works anymore, in the same way that we almost never have trials anymore in the United States. We see that that imagined image of the justice system all the time on TV and in the movies, but it's just not the reality day to day for almost everyone in court. One of the reasons for that is mandatory sentences, like the gun possession sentences I was talking about in New York. Once you have a mandatory sentence, then the punishment is baked into the charge and into the plea bargain that the prosecutor agrees to. And those are really prosecutorial decisions. So the Supreme Court comes into my story in a few ways. One important way is this case from the 1970s. I'd never heard of it before I started reporting my book, but it's called Bordenkircher versus Hayes. And it's a case in which a man named Paul Hayes passed an $88.30 bad check to buy groceries for his family. He was poor. He had a bunch of brothers and sisters he was helping to support. And the prosecutor wanted him to plead guilty and take a prison sentence of 5 years for this check. Paul Hayes said, no, I want to go to trial. And the prosecutor said, okay, but you have a criminal record. And if you go to trial, I'm going to charge this bad check as your third strike, and you're going to face a life sentence. So Paul Hayes rolled the dice. He lost. He got the life sentence. And then he appealed to the Supreme Court. And his lawyer's argument at that stage was, look, there should be some limits on what prosecutors can threaten because someone wants to go to trial. Like, we all have a constitutional right to go to trial, and we're burdening that right too much if you can face a life sentence for an $88 check. That's just out of proportion. The Supreme Court rejected that argument and said, effectively, too bad. You knew what you were getting into. We think you have the same kind of bargaining power as prosecutors, and we are not going to set any constitutional limits on plea bargaining. So that's a key reason that plea bargains have become not just like part of our system, but effectively our whole system. We now have a system in which in most state court systems, only 2 or 1% of convictions happen through trials. Everybody else either has their charges dismissed because they usually delay tactics. That's really what defense lawyers have now. Sometimes cases fall apart, and everybody else pleads guilty through a plea bargain.
Plea bargaining. I guess I kind of want to go down that road a little bit more. Yep. Does plea bargaining not also kind of, serve to keep the system moving? Does it not? I mean, is that why prosecutors maybe start off with, the harshest charge they can, because it's going to get busted down in the course of a plea bargain?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, this is what keeps the wheels of the system turning. One thing I've been doing since my book came out is going around the country and talking to prosecutors in different district attorneys' offices, and I'm actually going to come back here and do that in the Cook County DA's office, or state's attorney's office, you guys call it, in a few weeks. And you can imagine I'm getting pushback from some prosecutors, and it's especially about plea bargaining. They say, well, are you saying we shouldn't plea bargain? And don't you recognize that sometimes in plea bargaining, we are giving the defendant a break when you think of the maximum punishment they could face that the legislature is telling us we have available. So I'm not arguing for an end to plea bargaining. It's too hard to imagine the American system without it, though I will tell you that in Europe, they rarely use it, and has a much more limited role. Though it's also true that in Europe, they have such a different, I would argue, better system in some countries that we'd have to make lots of changes to get there. But what I do think is that plea bargaining has allowed prosecutors to just really exert leverage over people and I would say coerce them into pleading guilty to crimes. And that this is part of why we have so many people locked up, is that people take shorter sentences because they start from this baseline of longer sentences. And we also know that 18% of the people who've been exonerated in the last several years have been people who pled guilty. So there is a degree to which the right to a trial and to challenging the state's evidence is being burdened so much that even people who are factually innocent are saying, this is too big a risk. That seems to me like a system that has gone off the rails in some way and needs to be reined in. I have yet to hear a prosecutor's office tell me that they have a clear way of ensuring that they are not overcharging and forcing too harsh plea bargains. There are some efforts to try it out, different kinds of solutions, but it's really case by case. I'm not sure anyone has come up with a systemic way to really rein this in.
You also write that there's a culture in prosecutors' offices that lends itself to this kind of overzealousness and take the harshest charge and get that sentence.
Yeah, so for example, in Amy Wyrick's office in Memphis, they give out Hammer Awards, and you get a Hammer Award as a prosecutor if you win a big trial, or especially if you get a long sentence. Someone comes afterwards, tapes a picture to your door of a hammer, everybody takes you out for a drink. That's the moment you get rewarded. And you can imagine that promotions also come from these kinds of achievements. So that's creating a particular set of incentives for prosecutors about what they need to do to succeed in the job. You can understand why winning a trial would be something you'd celebrate, but if you're not also rewarding people for declining to take bad cases if the cops make an illegal arrest, or diverting people into treatment or social work programs, or just away from an overly incarcerating system, those things also need to be rewarded. And again, that's a kind of matter of the internal culture of a prosecutor's office and figuring out different ways to make people feel like this is why I do my job.
There are also, you write about the diversion programs, several in Brooklyn that they offer, specifically in Kevin's case in Brooklyn. Tell us about those programs.
Yeah, so Brooklyn has this unusual diversion program that Kevin benefited from. It is actually operated out of the Brooklyn DA's office by social workers. So they're social workers working with prosecutors. And what happens is that defendants like Kevin, who are found guilty of possessing a gun, they plead guilty, they accept a prison sentence. In Kevin's case, it was 2 years. Some of the defendants I saw pled guilty to 15 years. And then that sentence is effectively suspended while they try to complete this year-long program in which they have to either have a job or go to some educational classes. They have to abide by a curfew. There's, at this point, random drug testing. Kind of markers along the way that are providing some structure to their lives. And what I saw in this program was sort of mixed. So the good parts of it are that they're social workers who are really, like the other social workers we were talking about, really trying to make people's lives better and give them tools to start working, to get their GEDs, to go to community college. I saw all of that happening. The problem with this program, from my point of view, was that the police, and to some degrees, other parts of the prosecutor's offices, continued to target these young men for extra surveillance. So, for example, in Brooklyn, they've more or less, not entirely, but they're mostly not charging people for smoking marijuana anymore, except if you have an open case, and being in this program counts as having an open case. So I was following people, they'd be out with their friends, smoking pot in the park, everybody else would be let go, and they would get arrested, which then put them at risk of having to serve their whole prison sentence. So the police not being on board for this program was really, in some ways, putting the defendants in this difficult position of being tracked and followed, and this continued even after they had successfully completed the program.
And then you also kind of run into the situation, and the same can be said, of people who are coming home from prison and, making their reentry and trying to right themselves, but they only go back to the same community where some of this is, the police checking people all the time for guns or drugs or whatever, and or being around, that same community of people. They have a hard time staying out of trouble if that's what they want, if that's what they're
Yeah,
trying to do.
so we're at this moment right now, and I know that this has happened some in Chicago with people called violence interrupters, who are in communities, often have experience of street violence or being in the system, and they're trying to kind of be healers who are preventing violence. So they're doing their work, and there's some evidence that they can be really effective. That's happening in Brooklyn. They're called credible messengers. That's one of the ways of thinking about the work they're doing. And yet, you also have this data-driven surveillance by police and prosecutors that effectively assumes that if you had a gun once, like, you're always going to be a danger. So, for example, one of Kevin, the main character I followed in my book, he got on one of these lists in New York City. And one night the cops knocked on his door. Someone had told them he had a gun. They ripped his apartment apart. They handcuffed him to his bed. It didn't matter that he'd successfully done a whole year of diversion, that he'd gotten his GED, that he had a job. They didn't care about any of it. They said, we know that you had a gun once, and like, we're gonna look for the next one. He did not have a gun. And the cops didn't find anything that night. But for him, that was a deflating, humiliating experience, right? I mean, I have kids who are not very much younger than Kevin, and if my kids felt constantly like they were an object of suspicion, that there's no such thing as a real second chance, because once you did this, you're kind of marked, that is a really limiting factor in how people conceive of their lives and their futures. So I think there's a real struggle and tension right now about what it means to really give someone a second chance.
Are prosecutors and judges reluctant ever to agree to sending someone to a diversion program? You write about someone named Tyrone Howard, and we're all familiar with Willie Horton. Most of us are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought this up because it's a constant problem, I would argue, that someone who gets a second chance and then blows it and hurts someone, those headlines, it's an unusual case, but it looms so large in how we think about the work of judges or the work of prosecutors, mayors, how we judge the system. The one person like Willie Horton who screws up. And those are tragedies, absolutely. But when they drive policy, when we kind of let the worst case scenario that is unusual ruin things for all the people who get a second chance and actually thrive, that seems like, a real problem for the way we operate. And yet it happens over and over again. I did hear a story about this recently that struck me as hopeful in the sense that it was an answer to this problem. So I was writing a story for the New York Times, and the prosecutor in Seattle, Dan Satterberg, he's been elected. He's been trying to do progressive reforms for a while now, like an unusual kind of veteran in this movement. And he has asked the governor, he was looking back at the 3 strikes convictions from his office from the 80s and 90s, looking at people who are in prison for life for not having killed someone. And he asked the governor to commute 21 sentences of people who, had been convicted as teenagers or young men of things like armed robbery, but were now in their, 50s or 60s. And so 21 of these folks have gotten out, and one of them killed someone after he was released. So when I found that, as I was reporting, I thought, oh no, that must be the end of this effort. So I called Dan Satterberg and asked him, and he said, look, that was a terrible outcome. I'm terribly sorry it happened. But when you look at the overall rate of reoffending of these 21 people, it's much lower than other people who've committed violent offenses who we've let out. And I'm not gonna stop looking for more people to let out of prison, because I think these long sentences were wrong. So anyway.
You write about bail, and you spend a lot of time talking about bail in this country. What's wrong with, from your perspective, from your reporting, what's wrong with that system, and how does it lend itself to all that plea bargaining that happens?
Yeah, so bail was something that kind of blew my mind when I learned about it for my book. I assumed that the reason we have cash bail and a bail industry is that this is what it takes to get people to come back to court, right? You put money down, that gives you a reason not to flee, and that's necessary. We must have figured this out over time. It turns out that's just not true. So to begin with, the United States is one of only 2 countries in the world that allows for-profit bail. The other country is the Philippines. Everyone else assumes that this could be really ripe for exploitation and abuse. And we actually have places in the US, Washington, D.C. and Kentucky, that have operated without cash bail for decades, and almost everybody comes back to court. So it turns out if you ask people to come back and they sign their names and they promise to do that, and then if you send them reminders and sometimes connect them with support services, that's enough. They come back, because it's not cool to have a warrant out for your arrest. It doesn't actually, the people don't take advantage very often of that limited moment of freedom, because they know there are worse consequences out there afterward. It is also true that in DC and Kentucky, there are people who commit very violent offenses who look like a real risk to public safety, and that small fraction of people goes to jail. But most people, pre-trial I mean, but most people get out. And these are people who are presumed innocent. The reason it matters so much for plea bargaining is that, to state the obvious, when you're being held in jail before your trial, you have a real incentive to just sign the piece of paper, plead guilty to something so you can go home. And a lot of people end up with criminal records because of exactly that dynamic. So that is why ending the cash bail system as we know it has become such a pressing issue for criminal justice reformers.
Some of those reformers, you write a whole chapter about the new DAs, including Cook County's own state's attorney, Kim Foxx. Tell us about these new DAs and the reforms they're implementing.
So what has happened in 2016 and since then is a group of prosecutors around the country have run for office promising to shrink down this whole system, to basically fight back against mass incarceration. One thing some of them talk about is making jail and prison a last resort. And I see progressive in this story as being one that's not like about liberal promises, and it's certainly not about being soft. It's really the idea of looking at the evidence about what is effective for preventing crime and trying to make sure that we're using our resources in the most effective way. One of the most interesting things about this to me was that local organizing groups have really made this happen. So that's true in Chicago. There are a number of groups here. In every city that's elected a progressive, promising DA, it's really bubbled up from the grassroots. And then there's also a kind of donor class who've come in and provided some money to these candidates. So it's sort of this twofold effort. And I think when you look at the idea of having a DA who's accountable to a different constituency, that person can become a real force against the inertia of this giant machine we've created. It's not easy. It doesn't always go smoothly. Kim Foxx is having her issues here in Chicago. It's true for a lot of these folks who get elected. They run up against resistance. They don't necessarily do everything right. But one hopes that in the end, they're able to reduce the size of the system and the human toll it's taking, and then leave their cities in better, healthier shape in a way that then makes those cities a model and kind of proves to legislatures, which can be harder to convince, like, hey, you know what? It's safe, like actually safe and politically safe to try to reduce punishment and pull back some of these mandatory sentences that have had such a big impact.
You're right, though, that some of them, they are new and they are coming into an office full of attorneys and lawyers who've been doing it a certain way, and they face challenges in their own offices.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been experiencing some of that as I go around to the DA's offices and I talk a little bit and then I ask for questions because, from my point of view, it's really interesting to hear what they're called line prosecutors, what their experience of this is. Some of them seem like they're on board. Some of them have pushed back really hard and said, you're blaming us unfairly. We need plea bargaining. And in the worst cases, I think you just see a total defensiveness that's not open to rethinking. One of the most interesting moments I've had about this was, I was with Eric Gonzalez and we were talking to like 200 of his attorneys in his office, which I was kind of nervous about because I had been reporting on them and like, what if they thought I'd gotten the whole thing wrong? And someone asked a question in which he said, you're giving us too much blame for this picture. And so Gonzalez answered, and he said, look, I was one of you. He's someone who was a career prosecutor. So he spent his whole life and his whole career in the Brooklyn DA's office. And he said, look, it's really hard to look back on how I did my job all those years and think that when I thought I was doing good, that actually I might have been doing harm. I thought I was doing the right thing for Brooklyn and for community safety, but maybe we were making things worse. I think hearing that message from a fellow prosecutor is really different from hearing it from an outsider. It's just easier to absorb. And so I think, again, that's one thing that DAs can offer when they come in as progressives. They can start talking prosecutor to prosecutor, which is different from a journalist like sitting in judgment of you.
Then there's also the pushback from the police departments. For example, Cook County State's Attorney, I think just a couple of weeks ago, the suburban police chiefs associations around Chicago, as well as the powerful Chicago Police Union, have all taken a vote of no confidence on her. So there's also the pushback that they get from the police departments who do the investigative work, and they feel like the prosecutors aren't prosecuting the cases they're bringing.
Right. So, nobody likes to be told that their sort of partner is no longer going along with the program in the way they always did. In some cities, there's actually money on the line in the sense of overtime. I don't know if that's true here, but in Philadelphia, for example, where the new DA, Larry Krasner, has gotten a lot of pushback from the police, one of the things happening is that if you arrest someone in Philadelphia and that person is charged, you get 2 days in court of full overtime pay. There is actually like a tradition in Philly that, the arresting officer buys the prosecutor lunch as a thank you for those 2 days of overtime pay. Yeah, that's how it works. So the cops don't want to lose that system. They don't want to be told, like, we're not charging anymore for, smoking marijuana or trespassing, because that has actual value to the police officers. It has always been assumed that prosecutors alienate the cops at their peril, and that you can't get reelected, that these people have to work together, and that you can't challenge the police. I think some of these new prosecutors they're out to prove that's not true. And maybe that will help change the internal culture of the police department over time, because if you're not getting your overtime pay, maybe you're not going to be making these low-level arrests, which really don't line up with community safety. Or maybe there's going to be some greater clash later on. I think it's really too early to tell, but it's a very interesting kind of new dynamic in city politics.
And that just seems like the whole lunch tradition. I mean, I know it's kind of an unspoken thing, but like as journalists, I can't be best friends with the people that I cover. Yes, you want to have a good working relationship, but then you run into a situation where, obviously, as in Chicago, we have had a state's attorney charge a police officer with a crime. So if those two offices are too close, it seems like you run into another one of those situations where maybe you've got a prosecutor who's like, I'm not prosecuting that cop, we're good friends.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Brooklyn one day, I was in this gun court that I was covering, and this young man was facing gun charges, and the defense lawyer looked at the police report. The arresting officer, she recognized his name. He'd just been written up in the New York Daily News for being someone who the city had to pay out $120,000 in fines because of illegal arrests he was making. So she said to the prosecutor, like, are you kidding? Are you really going to stand by this guy's word? Like, this cop is someone who can't be trusted. Why are you relying on him? So the prosecutor didn't say anything. The charges were filed. A few weeks later, magically, the case gets dismissed. But magically and quietly, that cop is still working in New York, and not necessarily, the next time around, he may be relied on. So I think these are these endemic problems with trying to change a system. Who's actually the watchdog in the story? What are the checks on these people who have so much power, right? Police and prosecutors, in one moment, they can change the course of our lives. So who is watching to make sure that they are doing their jobs legally and well? And look, I want to make clear, most police officers and most prosecutors want to do everything they can to uphold the law, right? That's why they're in their jobs. They have high ethical standards. The problem is that that's not universal, and the rules right now allow for a lot of hiding of corruption.
Then there are the victims of the crimes, whatever the crime may be. It's one thing to have a gun, but it's another thing to commit a crime against someone with a gun. So I think you write a case about a victim of a robbery who felt that the man who robbed them wasn't seriously punished. So where is the balance between reform and what we think is justice?
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought this up, because the experience of victims is so crucial to the criminal justice system. And currently, in every survey of victims, they express feelings of disappointment and betrayal with the system. They often feel ignored or sidelined, frustrated by how long cases drag on for. They're not really well served by our current system. On the other hand, the system doesn't exist to give victims total power over someone's punishment. And so that case you brought up in Brooklyn, this was a case of a homeless man who committed a break-and-entry crime into someone's house. He thought there was no one home. He took a laptop, sold the laptop. In fact, there was someone home. In New York right now, crime is down so low that the police had time to come in and dust for fingerprints, find this guy, and then the question was like, well, what's supposed to happen to him? So the original charge carried a mandatory prison sentence of a couple years. The defense lawyer looked at his client who, like I said, was homeless, was struggling with alcoholism, was able, this is the same Brooklyn Defender Services, they were able to route this man, his nickname is Kiki, into drug treatment and some counseling. And then the defense lawyer used delay to kind of see what was going to happen to Kiki. And Kiki really cleaned up his act. He went to counseling, he stopped drinking, he got a job, he moved in with his girlfriend. Girlfriend's about to have a baby. It's now a year and a half later. And the defense lawyer is saying to the prosecutor, are we really going to send this guy to Rikers? What's the point of this? The victims, though, wanted him to go to jail. And so the case went all the way up to Eric Gonzalez to basically decide what to do with these charges. And Gonzalez said, look, it's really important that we kept the victims informed the whole way, but I'm not going to do what they want in this case. I don't think that public safety is served by sending Kiki to jail. And so Kiki was able to take a kind of deferred offer in which he still faced jail time for 6 months if he dropped out of his counseling, but as long as he kept going, he did not have to go to jail after all. It's not a story that necessarily satisfied the victims in this case, but I hope at least that the fact that the DA's office kept them on board and kept consulting them the whole time made a difference. And you can imagine a world in which you could have restorative justice practice in a case like this, where victims would come in and meet someone, they would see how Kiki was doing over time, and maybe some of their need to send him to jail or prison would go away based on how well he was doing. But Brooklyn didn't have that kind of restorative practice for a case like this, so I can't tell you whether it would have worked.
I'm going to come to you all for questions in just a second, but I want to ask one more question. I wanted to tell you and give you an advance notice so you can be thinking of your question. What do prosecutors need to create further reform?
So I think the main thing they need are examples of things that work. And I ended my book with an appendix of 21 different principles for them to follow. Everything from here's a place that stopped arresting people for marijuana or small amounts of opioids, and here is an example of a treatment program that works. And I did that deliberately. I wanted to offer a kind of blueprint for reform going forward. I think the kind of overall principle here is about making jail and prison the last resort, and also about just declining to arrest or prosecute people whose problems just are not a good match for the criminal justice system. People with mental illness and drug abuse problems, they're just very rarely well served. We as a community are rarely well served by trying to deal with their problems through criminal justice.
You also write that one of the young men you were talking to, they carry guns because they feel the need to feel safe. Obviously, the gun makes them feel safer. And so then doesn't it become sort of a chicken and an egg, right? Because you won't have these gun charges if people feel safer. But how do you make them safer?
Yeah, no, this was something I heard over and over again from young men in Brooklyn, that they carried guns for protection. So first I thought they meant actual self-defense. That is not what they mean. And I talked to people who got shot while they had a gun on them. It was not actually an effective means of self-defense. Guns create more danger. They're not, you can't control them once they're there. And especially when you're talking about teenagers and young men, which is almost always who you're talking about in this context, it is for sure a source of danger. So the question for me became okay, well, what about the circumstances of these people's lives explains this vaguer sense that they need a gun for protection? And how do we change that? How do we make these neighborhoods places like the neighborhood I want to live in, where you don't have that kind of prevalence? And those are deep questions. It kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of violence interrupters. But I think grappling with that, those questions of safety is such a necessary conversation, and one that we're really not yet having enough in this country.
I'm guessing you all have questions as well. We have a microphone in the corner over here, and another one in the corner over here.
Hi, folks. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and Jim or I will come to you.
Hi, my name is Jonah, and I'm a newspaper reporter in Wisconsin. And the courthouse, the judges and the DA that I cover strongly, they repeat often that strong sentences are a deterrence to future crime. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on what the argument is against that maybe that isn't the case, and maybe that our understanding of that has evolved, and what the evidence is that supports that argument that it's not such a deterrence as we might think.
Yeah, so look, when you put people in jail or prison while they are there, they cannot commit crimes outside of jail or prison, right? Like, they're incapacitated. That's the fancy word. And when the National Academies of Science looked at this a few years ago, like, no reason to trust me on this, they're the gold standard. They said, yes, like, incapacitation has a modest effect on reducing crime, and deterrence more broadly, like other people not committing crimes, also this modest effect was the term they used. So I think you can send them the National Academies of Science report, not that anyone will go read it. But the point is that it is true that prison is a deterrent. It is also true that we have ratcheted up sentencing and prison admissions far, far beyond what we need for deterrence at this point. You just can't justify it in deterrence terms. It is really mostly about retribution and just treating some people as permanent, as we're throwing them away. And then the other thing that's, to me, really interesting, recently, other researchers have looked at what's called the criminogenic effect of jail. And so this is a word like carcinogenic, where you can actually show that people who go to jail and prison are more likely after they get out to commit more crimes, right? I mean, it makes sense. They often have trouble finding housing, finding jobs. Their lives are more desperate. So there are some people who are now arguing that when you take into account the criminogenic effect of jail and prison, it cancels out the deterrent effect. I'm not sure we know that to be the case, but I think it is absolutely clear, as I was saying before, that what we're doing now is wildly beyond what's necessary for deterrence.
We have a question over here in the back.
I was wondering if you thought that there should be more pushback on the legislative branch. You know, if you want to make these things less crime, you know, you're talking about a smaller amount of marijuana or whatever, that why isn't that part of it? Why does the prosecutor now become the one who determines what's going to be the law, so to speak? And then also, sorry, I'm
okay.
A police officer.
A two-part question.
Two parts.
You just have to remind me of the second part if I forget.
Okay. And then I was just wondering about the cost. I mean, all these programs sound wonderful, but I know they're very labor intensive, and it sounds good for a small group, but when they expand these programs, generally it becomes, once again, another bureaucracy that just funnels people through a system.
Okay, so why prosecutors and cost? So if I was going to wave a magic wand, I would have state legislatures repeal laws. Like, that's the clean fix. That's what they're elected to do. It doesn't depend on one elected official in a city saying, I'm going to decline to prosecute, which is kind of weird and just gives them more discretion and decision-making authority, right? But it's really hard to get the state legislature to do things like this. You've, I'm sure, noticed there are many of them, and they represent lots of competing interests. And so I'm just not optimistic that that is going to happen quickly or easily. I think it's more likely that you see these DAs bringing down the numbers in cities. Then if those cities are good, healthy places to live, that makes it easier for the legislators to act down the line. And, you know, look, I also am someone, I love cities. I grew up in Philadelphia. I live in New Haven, Connecticut, a little baby city. And I think that there's a way in which the local power of voters, the idea that, like, the local DA, that person's power, that's our power. That's very direct aspect of democracy. You can have a big effect with not very many voters and just in your local community. There's something very satisfying about that right now when, fixing Washington seems so hard to imagine, and even affecting your state legislature can feel pretty remote. So that's my answer for why prosecutors. It's a second best remedy, but I think a more realistic one for starters. About cost, look, there is nothing more expensive than incarcerating people. Like, it just costs gazillion dollars what we're doing. Billions and billions of dollars. Mostly spent, by the way, on the salaries of public sector prison guards, with a little money for private prisons in some states. But really, we're talking about the prison industrial complex as a public sector giant creation. And so if you shift some of that money away from incarceration and into social service programs, you're going to save money in the end. It is true that you're talking about another government program. And so if you just want to starve the government, this is not like your preferred option. But in terms of overall savings, there's just no question that it's cheaper, because like nothing else costs the astronomical costs of prison.
Jim?
Hi. Emily, I want to go back to the issue of the victim rights, because in more serious cases, it's not so easy. Prosecutors find it really hard to tell victims of crime, especially violent crime, that they shouldn't lock up the people. And the victims, at least in Illinois, seem to have a lot of power over parole decisions. And just, how do you change that?
Yeah, so I think look, this may seem a little like rosy-eyed to you, but I don't think that victims are monolithic. I think that if victims had more choices, if they saw that, restorative justice practice, like coming together, trying to have a real reckoning with the harm that's been done, looking for remedies that actually leave people better off, if they see that working, I think that they could be much more open to it than the politics currently suggest. My examples of this, one comes from a program in Brooklyn called Common Justice, in which the people who are in this program are convicted of violent felonies, and they only are allowed in if victims want to participate in it with them. 90% of victims say yes. The woman who runs this program is named Danielle Sered, and she also has a book out, which is a good book about this topic. And, she quotes moms who say things like, this young man tried to kill my son. The first thing I wanted to do was set him on fire. And then I thought, what is really going to make this community a better place to live in? Sending this kid to prison when he's going to come out and probably commit more harm, or trying to make things better for him? One dynamic here that I think is underappreciated is how much the communities of people who are victims and who commit violence overlap at this point of time. They're often one and the same. And so I think that if we provide some more options to people, there could be a greater possibility for victims to come on board. I'm not saying that's going to be true for everyone. I know that the impulse for retribution can be really strong, and I respect that. I'm not trying to say that I'm telling victims what to do, but right now we're basically only offering one real road for people to go down to feel like their harm was redressed, and if they had more options, maybe that could change.
We have another question over here.
Hi, my name is Miguel Blanchard Jr., born and raised and currently residing in the Southwest Side in the Little Village neighborhood. My question is about the criminal justice system in general, right? You mentioned that there are certain European countries that have better versions. Do you think that this is potentially an issue that will garner enough attention to make it an agenda issue for a presidential candidate, for example?
So, the United States is often not that interested in learning from other countries. We tend to think that our justice system is the best one. Don't tell us what Sweden or Germany is doing. But when you look at their results, both low crime rates and also this sort of basic premise that people who commit crimes are not people we're going to throw away forever. They just have shorter sentences. Most prisons operate as places that are trying to prepare you to go back into the world. People have access to things like knives because they're using them in some kind of vocational training, or they're just being treated as like normal human beings. It's just such a different approach. I do think that these questions about criminal justice reform, even if we don't like become Europe tomorrow, are coming into the conversation about the presidential campaign in a way that's sort of surprising. So, in the last week, there was a big debate about whether people who are incarcerated should be able to vote. That is something that, like, in the last election, I am sure it didn't come up. There have been questions about Kamala Harris's record as a prosecutor, like, was she too harsh? Can she really claim to be a progressive? Again, like years ago, that just was not, it was assumed that it was beneficial to come into a race as a prosecutor. And now we're having a conversation about Joe Biden and his support for the crime bills of the 80s and 90s. What kind of reckoning is he going to make with that aspect of his record? So this is something, we can all do. Like, we can measure candidates by this yardstick. We can decide that this is an issue that matters at the voting booth. That's what will make the candidates address it.
I think someone on this side has the microphone.
Yes, I believe you mentioned that people who were in diversionary programs had a significantly lower rate of reoffending than people who simply got out of prison because they had served their terms. But isn't it true to think that the people who were in diversionary programs are a very pre-selected population? These were people who were probably very well behaved in prison, had good attitudes and so on, and led authorities to think that they should go to a diversionary program. So how do you know the diversionary program was making a difference?
Yeah, like, are we cherry picking, basically? I mean, you're certainly right, that can be a concern. I was talking about these particular programs, so like this program for gun offenders in Brooklyn I was talking about. They are screening people, but here's the criteria. You just have to be between the ages of 16 to 24, and you have to have a parent, a parent or guardian, someone stable at home who's going to help you through the program. Now, that is a kind of cherry picking, because it means that people who are homeless or have really unstable home situations don't get in. That's a problem, I would argue. But we're not talking about like the gold star kids who just did one thing wrong. Like, we're really not. I mean, having followed several dozen of them, like, these are young men with guns. They were nobody's idea of angelic, and some of them did have criminal records and a history of gang involvement. So this program in Brooklyn is unusual, but its success suggests that we're not being imaginative enough in who we imagine as a candidate for diversion.
Do we have time for one more?
Just one more here.
Just one more. I think she's been waiting for a bit. If you come forward on your left, I'm sorry.
Nope, no problem.
I've seen that hand a few times. Thanks for your patience.
Appreciate it, thank you. Yeah, hi, thanks for being here. So I study prosecutorial discretion and prosecutor-led diversion. And one of the things I'm seeing is that I'm very fearful of, given that we have over 4 million people on community supervision,
Yes.
Which far exceeds what we have in cages, is that I'm seeing these diversion programs actually be net widening. And so one of the things I want to ask you to maybe kind of what your thoughts are on is kind of putting the onus on the carceral state to address social issues when it was never in fact meant to do that, and how we can even really do that when it's purely really meant to punish.
Yeah, I mean, this is a huge concern, right? So, like, if you create a good program that's an alternative to prison, you end up with even more people under supervision, when being under supervision creates a direct risk of ending up in the cage, right? So if you're in parole and probation in this country, first of all, there are more than 4 million people in supervised release. That's like the catch-all term. And they have an average of more than 20 conditions they have to abide by, all kinds of technicalities like curfews and unannounced home visits and not traveling out of the state, things that are not crimes, like things you and I do every day, and they can go to jail for doing them. And they're also just having this much more invasive presence of the government in their lives. So So I do think net widening is a concern. I also think, though, that we have to have there are some people who we're not going to just like release. People caught with guns in Brooklyn, like given the state laws now and what a heavy lift it would be to change them, you need to have some kind of interim step. So the trick is to design them carefully so that they're truly an alternative to incarceration in not an addition to incarceration. You can do that by putting limits on them, and you can also do that by at the same time advocating for shrinking the net that you're talking about. So Eric Gonzalez in Brooklyn just came out and said, you know what, we have been asking for the maximum parole or probation period after prison in our sentences. We're going to stop doing that. We're going to start asking for the minimum. Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, similar kind of move. And I think this is a really important thing to ask DAs, your DA, every DA, to be considering, because that long tail of punishment, it can really like whip back and yank people backwards. I'm going to say one more thing about this. I've been working on a podcast that's like a mini series that is a companion to my book, which Brandis
Also called Charged.
Thank
Excellent.
you.
I recommend.
Which was very nice of Brandis to listen to. And I'm super into this project. I've never done audio journalism like this before. I love the power and intimacy of hearing people's voices. And one of the upcoming episodes is about someone who got yanked back into Rikers 12 days before his 5 years of parole were about to be over. And you really, that story is not online yet. We're still working on it. But if you listen to it in a few weeks, I think you will see an illustration of exactly the kind of danger that you're talking about.
We are just about out of time. Before I let you go, I want to ask you quickly, you spent a lot of time with Nora and Kevin. How are they?
I'm so glad you asked that. So Nora's doing pretty well. She moved to Brooklyn a year ago, and she's going to community college right now, living in her own apartment for the first time. She's still struggling with lots of different trauma, and she's also never been exonerated, so she has that hanging over her head. Kevin is working. He's still living in Brownsville, which is the part of Brooklyn that he's from. I don't want to say too much else about him because I've gone to such lengths to protect his privacy, but he's doing okay.
Help me thank Emily Bazelon, please, and thank you.
Thanks so much to all of you, and I'd love to sign books for anyone who wants one.
Oh yeah, I should mention, she'll be signing books.